Welcome to session 4 of our class on the conquest to the divided kingdom. We're in Joshua chapter 2, verse 22. In verses 22 through 24, the chapter wraps up quickly, telling of the spies hiding in the hills for 3 days, their pursuit being called off, and then their return to Joshua across the Jordan and their confident report to him. And during these 3 days, we can presume that the people were making ready for their journey according to Joshua's instructions in chapter 1 and verse 11, where he stated that 3 days from now you will cross the Jordan. Now the spies' report in verse 24 is simple, confident, and direct, in contrast to the detailed and pessimistic majority report from the 10 spies sent out earlier. That's found in Numbers chapter 13. Now these 2 spies, their words are taken essentially word for word from Rahab's statement to them in verse 9. And the way is paved for the action that begins at Jericho in chapter 6. The chapter therefore ends with a positive word for Israel and the go-ahead for it finally to enter the land of Canaan. Now we come to chapter 3. The section of chapters 3, 4, and 5 talk about crossing the Jordan. In chapters 3 and 4, these chapters belong together since they both discuss the crossing of the Jordan River. Specifically, the emphasis in these 2 chapters is not so much on the crossing per se. This could have been mentioned in just a few short verses. As it is, it's more on Israel's proper observance and remembrance of this great defining event. The crossing itself was an event on a par with the crossing of the Red Sea. Both events involved God's miraculous intervention in parting the Red Sea specifically, or stopping up the Jordan in this case. Waters or bodies of water that were barriers to Israel. Now, these are the only 2 events in the entire Bible where this type of divine intervention on behalf of the nation takes place. Now, I believe it's either Elijah or Elisha that will he'll strike the water, maybe even both of them, I think, with a coat, I believe, and part the waters in those cases for them to be able to cross, but that's on an individual level. This is a national level. Now, because of the miraculous and amazing things that God was about to do for Israel, the author of the book slows down here and lets us savor this wonderful event from a slow, deliberate build-up in verses 1 through 13 of chapter 3 to a deliberate and repetitive climax in chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. And this is followed by a satisfying and drawn-out reflection on its significance in chapters 4 and 5. Now, 2 major episodes then make up these chapters. Number 1, there is the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River. And number 2, there's the setting up of memorial stones to commemorate the event. Now, the story of the crossing is told in a fairly straightforward fashion in chapter 3, with a few exceptions that will be noted. In chapter 4, however, the story becomes much more repetitive as the author reflects on the glorious event that has transpired. In the process, the chronology becomes difficult to follow in several places. However, the author's primary concern is not chronology, but theological reflection. Now, when we come to chapter 3 specifically then, after centuries of waiting, hundreds and hundreds of years from the time that the promise is first made to Abraham to the time that they are now actually crossing the Jordan. We're talking at about, I think, around 700 years. Yeah, that'd be about right. So after centuries of waiting, the Israelites are now about to cross into the land that had been promised to Abraham. Before the actual crossing, final instructions are in order. And the author spends considerable time reviewing these instructions, verses 1 through 13. Now, the focus is on the Ark of the Covenant and the people's relation to the Ark. They were not supposed to get close to it. They were also to make proper preparations for witnessing the great wonders that God had in store for them, according to verse 5. Now, verse 1 specifically, we find Joshua and all Israel setting out early in the morning from Shittim, where they had been encamped since their triumph over Sihon and Og in the wilderness, in Numbers chapter 25. Verse 2, the people encamped at Shittim for 3 days, or had done so. At the end of this period, the officers went through the camp with the instructions for the people. In verse 3, the Ark of the Covenant is mentioned here for the first time in the book of Joshua, and it is an important focal point in this chapter. The Ark was the most holy physical possession of Israel, since it symbolized God's very presence, and it contained 3 symbols of Israel's relationship with God. Number 1, the tablets of the 10 Commandments. Number 2, the rod of Aaron the high priest. And number 3, a jar of manna. The priests were responsible for carrying the ark in accordance with the law of Moses, which accorded that responsibility to the tribe of Levi, Deuteronomy 10 and verse 8. You can also see Deuteronomy 31 and verse 9. Now, the ark was to be carried with poles through the rings that were on the side of the ark, and it was not to be touched. As the symbol of God's presence, a healthy distance was to be maintained between it and the people. Now, the ark is referred to in various ways in this chapter, and the most common phrase being the Ark of the Covenant. However, several references to it elevate it to even a more prominent status when we read the Hebrew carefully. The following are literal translations of the Hebrew. I think we've looked at these before, but let's see them a little bit more in detail here. In verse 11, the reading is the Ark of the Covenant, the Lord of all the earth. Verse 14, the Ark, the Covenant. Verse 17, we find the Ark, the Covenant of the Lord. Now, these references suggest such a close relationship between the Ark and the Covenant that it represents, that it is almost as if the Ark is the Covenant. God, whose very presence is associated with the Ark, is closely associated with the covenant as well. And these ways of referring to the Ark, highlight this point. Now, the priests, who are Levites, as we said, were supposed to carry the Ark. Since all legitimate priests were Levites, the expression here seems to be redundant. It may be a special reminder that these priests were indeed legitimate, and thus everything was in order. Also, the fact that the priests were to carry the ark highlights the importance of this special occasion, since it appears to have been more usual for Levites who were not priests to carry the ark. Now, the priesthood was restricted to Levites in general, but Aaron's family specifically, according to the Mosaic Law. Although all legitimate priests were Levites, not all Levites were priests. Their duties were different. Now, in chapter 3 and verse 4, this verse begins with an emphatic word, that introduces the warning about keeping a 1,000-yard distance from the ark. And the first sentence might be translated, "Be very sure that a distance of 1,000 yards remains between you and it." Now, this emphasizes the sacredness of the ark and the awesomeness of God's glory. Even though the ark symbolized God's presence among his people, his presence among them was not to be taken lightly or abused. When the Israelites prepared for receiving the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, they were to keep their distance from God there as well. These two aspects of God's nature, his close, comforting presence and his awesome, fearsome glory, are kept in a healthy balance in the Bible. The distance was for the purpose of the people's knowing the way that they should walk in, since they had never traveled that way before. The meaning of this statement surely was meant literally and physically. These Israelites had certainly not crossed a river in the way in which they would soon be doing, and they had not been in Canaan before. However, it is very possible that a spiritual meaning is intended here as well. That is because figurative references to walking in God's way are common in the Old Testament. In the Pentateuch alone, there are some 18 references to this. In these cases, what is meant is not a literal road or path, but a way of living, right living. In two cases, Exodus 18:20 and Deuteronomy 8 and verse 2, knowing or remembering the right way to go is stressed. Surely this was an appropriate charge for the Israelites as they entered the unknown land of Canaan with a mandate to do something that they had never done before: take the land and exterminate its inhabitants. As they kept a proper, reverent distance from the Ark of the Covenant, the Israelites would be shown in which way they should walk, both physically and spiritually. We find another wordplay here, this time with the verb know, K-N-O-W. In verse 4, the Israelites would know the right way to go as a result of their keeping their distance from the ark. In verse 7, they would also know that God was with Joshua as a result of God's exalting him on that day. And in verse 10, they would know that God was with them as a result of his driving out the various Canaanite peoples before them. Now in verse 5, after the officials had completed their instructions, Joshua gave them an additional task. That is, he told them to consecrate themselves. The Hebrew word here, or the Hebrew root word, is kadosh. It is in the same semantic field, same word field as such words, such English words as consecrate, sanctify, holy, and sacred. Although the term is not used very many times in Joshua, holiness is an important concept in the Old Testament. And the Israelites had had extensive instruction in God's holiness and their own need for holiness in the years prior to this, especially in the book of Leviticus. The core idea is that of separation, as we've seen before. Separation from things that are unclean or common. That is, anything that would contaminate one's relationship with a perfect God. Here, the people, and not just the priests, were to consecrate themselves. Their proper preparation would have included extensive and rigorous ritual preparation, including thorough washings and abstinence from sexual relations, and as well as from certain foods. God had instructed the Israelites in a similar way at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. The Hebrew word behind the New American Standard's translation of niplaot, the Hebrew word niplaot. The New American Standard translates the word wonders, wonders. This is the closest word in the Old Testament for what are called miracles in the New Testament. These wonders were such impressive acts that they astonished people and called forth their praise of God. They included God's miraculous works among the Egyptians, the plagues that were wrought against the Egyptians. And they included the miracle at the Red Sea and the miracles in the wilderness. They were so abnormal as to be unexplainable to people experiencing these things. And they could only explain them as mighty acts of God. Well, here in Joshua 3, the wonders were the stopping up of the waters of the Jordan. Now in verse 7, God speaks in verse 7 and verse 8. He speaks to Joshua for the first time since chapter 1. The words here are in fulfillment of those in chapter 1, especially about God's being with Joshua just as he had been with Moses, confirming his place as Israel's new leader. God's presence with him was important in encouraging him and validating him as Israel's leader. The initial confirmation of Joshua's leadership would be the great miracle that God would do on Israel's behalf. Interestingly, Joshua was not directly involved in the miracle at all, except in giving the people and the leaders their instructions. But he would nonetheless be made great in the eyes of Israel because of this. Now, the purpose of God's exalting Joshua was not for Joshua's own sake. Rather, it was for the larger purpose that Israel would know that God was with Joshua. Here, the author is emphasizing that the people would indeed know something that they would not otherwise know, that God was with Joshua in a special way. Again, how would they know this? Well, it would be through the great miracle that God would perform, which is looked at from so many different angles throughout chapters 3 and 4. Now, the priests carrying the ark there in verse 8 were actually to enter the water and stand there. This anticipates what would happen when they did this. The waters would actually stop flowing. Verses 9 and 10, the text begins a movement toward the climax of the chapter in verses 14 through 17. Joshua assembled the people to hear God's words, and he stated that there would be a specific way that they would know that God was in their midst and that he would drive out the nations. Now, this way is not stated until verse 13, when the wonderful things previewed in verse 5 are revealed to be the stopping of the Jordan's flow. Now, verse 10 is introduced by a short prepositional phrase, "By this you will know." This refers to the miraculous sign of the stopping of the water in verse 13, which is emphasized by the repeated verbs and the vivid imagery there. God's actions here were for a larger purpose than just Israel's crossing the Jordan. It was to demonstrate to Israel that the living God was among them. The reference here to the living God is most likely intended to contrast Israel's living, powerful God with the dead false gods of the 7 nations who are named in the verse. In Hosea chapter 1 and verse 10, this same term is used, and the context there is also a part of a contrast. There, God had instructed Hosea to name his 3rd child, "Not my people," Lo Ami, as an ironic reminder to Israel that they had gone astray. and they were like the pagans around them, not worthy of being called God's people. However, a promise of restoration follows in Hosea chapter 1, verses 10 and 11. And to those who would taunt Israel with the name, not my people, God responds forcefully that the Israelites were in reality the sons of the living God. Now, other uses of the term in the Old Testament also denote a contrast, usually between Israel's God and hostile pagan gods or forces. Here, then, the term the living God is used as an attack against God's enemies, who were also Israel's enemies. It was a forceful reminder to Israel that their God was not like the gods of the nations around them, nations whom they were going to displace. But rather, he was a powerful and living God, able to effect the type of miracle in view here. And this living God was among you, he says, literally in your midst, affirming the promise of God's presence that he had made to Joshua back in chapter 1. Now, the wordplay of knowing is continued in verse 10. The events that were soon to follow were not just for the purpose of getting the Israelites across the Jordan River. They were to attest, these events were to attest to the fact that the living God is among you. These wonderful acts were testimonies to God's glorious presence among his people working on their behalf. This exact wording, "this is how you will know," is found only one other time in the Old Testament, in Numbers 16 and verse 28, where God was authenticating Moses' position as his chosen leader. In this place, in Joshua, he is doing the same for Joshua. 7 groups of people are listed in verse 10. "23 times in the Old Testament, we find such lists, including 5 times in Joshua. The number and order of the names vary in each list, but 7 is used often, probably as a number symbolic of completeness. 12 peoples or nations occur in all, but a core of 7, the 7 mentioned here, comprises the standard list. In Joshua, these 7 nations are listed here at chapter 3 and verse 10, and also at chapter 24 and verse 11, while 6 nations are listed in the other 3 references. Now, the primary way in which the lists are used in the Old Testament is in connection with Israel's possession of the land of Canaan. These were the peoples or nations whom they were to displace. And the fact that they are commonly listed as separate nations, as opposed to being described simply as the people who live in the land, or inclusively as the Canaanites, this shows a contrast between the ethnic divisions among them, as opposed to the national unity that was so important for Israel. Furthermore, the list of peoples functioned to help the Israelites define themselves. That is, that the Israelites were not these wicked, divided nations, but rather one people, God's people. Now, the term Canaanite sometimes is an all-inclusive term denoting any people living in Canaan, regardless of their ethnic identity. Genesis 12:6, Genesis 36:2 and 3 are examples of this. Often, however, the Canaanites were distinguished from others who lived in Canaan, as they are here. In this case, they probably are the peoples living near the sea and near the Jordan River. Now, the Hittites appear in the Bible primarily in the hill country of Judah. Hebron, Beersheba, Bethel, and Jerusalem. Here in Joshua, the reference to them appears to be the same. Joshua 11:3 specifically states they lived in the hill country. As we all have already noted, there was a great Hittite kingdom of the middle and late 2nd millennium BC to the north of Israel's lands in northern Assyria, and remnants of this kingdom appear to be in view in the reference to Solomon's trading partners in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 29. The next three peoples in the list are relatively obscure. The Hivites were located in the mountainous region to the north in what is today Lebanon. The Perizzites appear to have lived in the forested areas of central Palestine in the highlands of Samaria. The Girgashites appear in the Bible only in the list of peoples. Based on where the other peoples lived, one commentator suggests that the only area left for the Girgashites was toward the north of Palestine. All three of these peoples are unknown outside the Bible. Now, like the term Canaanite, the term Amorite is sometimes used as an all-inclusive term referring to anyone living in Canaan. Elsewhere, it is a more limited term referring to areas in the central hill country of Canaan, or to kingdoms east of the Jordan River. Here, it probably refers to the people east of the Jordan. Outside the Bible, Amorites are known from early texts in Mesopotamia, there they are Westerners, that is, people coming from the west, from Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. Later, an Amorite kingdom is known with its capital at Sidon. And the Jebusites were the inhabitants of Jerusalem prior to the Israelites. They are the only ones in the list named for a city. Jebus was the name of Jerusalem when David captured it. Outside the Bible, the Jebusites are known from archaeological remains in Jerusalem, but not from literary sources. The standard list of 7 nations or peoples includes several very obscure peoples alongside several more prominent ones. Yet the list was selective, since additional peoples are mentioned in some texts. Why were these particular 7 chosen? Well, this probably was due in part, if not entirely, to the complete geographical picture obtained, since these peoples occupied the lands that the Israelites took. Now, in verses 11 through 13, Joshua now focused on the Israelites' attention on the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was to be their guide, and its position at the water's edge would signal the beginning of the miracle. Joshua's words in verse 12 about choosing 12 men anticipates the actions that Israel was to take after the crossing. God spoke these words to Joshua almost verbatim in chapter 4 and verse 2, adding that these men were to take up 12 stones for a memorial. Finally, in verse 13, the substance of the amazing things spoken of in verse 5 is revealed. When the priest carrying the ark stepped into the Jordan, the waters would stop flowing. The entire chapter thus far has been building to this revelation. In reality, probably most Israelites and most readers of this text would have guessed long before this what was going to happen. However, the author's presentation of the information draws out the suspense on a literary level and highlights the magnificence of the miracle. Here, the Lord is identified as sovereign over all the earth. Although the word for earth can also mean land. Now, if this is the intended meaning, it is nevertheless appropriate, since the Lord was not only sovereign over all the earth, but also the entire land of Canaan, which he was in process of giving to Israel. The stoppage of the waters is viewed in two ways here. Number one, they would be cut off. And number two, they would stand up in a heap. Now, in verses 14 through 17, these verses are the climax of the chapter. Here, the narrative or the telling of the account slows to a crawl, so to speak, so that the reader can savor the wonder of the miracle and view it from as many different perspectives as possible. The author, by writing in this way, affirms God's greatness and power and intervention on his people's behalf. The point is not so much that the people were able to cross over the Jordan, but in the manner in which they were able to cross, by a glorious and mighty miracle of God. The immediate purpose of the miracle was obviously to get Israel across the Jordan. However, the larger purpose was, as it is with all miracles, to testify to God's greatness and faithfulness, both to Israel and to all the peoples of the earth, and to stimulate proper worship of him. Now, that we are to be awed by the wonder of the miracle is clear as we read these two chapters, and especially when we reach the climax itself. Verses 14 through 16, here we finally read the account of the miracle that has been anticipated from the beginning of the chapter. It truly is a remarkable miracle. The Jordan River, we have to understand that at this time of the year, was at flood stage. It was completely, it was out of its banks. It was much wider than it normally is. And this flood stage river, probably because of the flooding, was flowing very fast. As I said, it was out of its banks. It was wider, deeper, larger, and faster than normal. It was stopped completely, stopped up, when the priest carrying the ark stepped into it, and the people were able to cross over on dry land. Now, I don't know how much opportunity you've had to actually be involved with a river of any kind, to a creek or a river that you may have go swimming in or whatever. When I was younger, I did that on many occasions. But whenever I went into these rivers or creeks, there was always a muddy bottom filled with, if it wasn't a very flat, fast-flowing river, it was filled with leaves and sticks and rocks and mud and so forth. If you walked out into it for a space before you started swimming, you had to walk through this gunk on the bottom, okay, in some cases. Now, in other cases, if the river was big enough and wide enough and fast-flowing enough, then, a lot of that junk would be washed down river as it never really collected. But sometimes it did. And even if you were able to stop the water completely, you would still have this wet, soggy bottom, okay, that was there. So there's actually, in my mind, two miracles going on here. You've got the stopping of the waters, but you've also got the drying of the ground. And it was immediate. Well, getting back to the text, in Hebrew, these verses constitute one long, drawn-out statement about the stopping up of the waters. And then that's followed by a short, abrupt statement about the people's crossing over. The drawn-out nature of these verses especially highlights the suspense and wonder until the powerful statements in verse 16 about the miracle itself. A literal translation of verses 14 through 16 would read as follows. And it happened. Now remember, this is one long drawn out statement. It's one long sentence up until you get to the idea of the waters rising up in a heap. Okay? But I'll stop right there and show you where the sentence ends. But here's the first part. And it happened when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the ark of the covenant before them. And when those carrying the ark came as far as the Jordan, and when the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped into the edge of the waters, now the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of the harvest, that the waters coming down from above stood. That's one long sentence. You just see the piling up of description until you get to the point where it says the waters stopped. And then the sentence, the verses go on with a new sentence. They rose up in one heap, a very far distance away, at Adam, the city that is opposite Zarethan, and the waters coming down upon the Sea of Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off. And the people crossed opposite Jericho. That last part is just one short sentence. And the people crossed opposite Jericho. Again, notice in verse 16, in quick succession, two verbs appear describing the water's stoppage. They stood up and they rose up. A few words later, two more verbs appear, describing this from a different perspective. They were completely cut off. In the short space of one verse, then, we find four different verbs reflecting on what happened to the waters. The language piles up, so to speak, in a manner that reminds us of the waters themselves piling up. Therefore, the passage's climax tells us in a very impressive way that the waters of the Jordan River, which, again, was at flood stage, were stopped up so that God's people could cross over and begin their mission in the Promised Land. In verse 17, here we have a wrap-up highlighting things already stated and adding a bit more that makes the miracle even more impressive. Just as the waters had stood, now the priests stand firm in the midst of the Jordan. After the reference to the people at the end of verse 16, they are referred to again twice in verse 17 in different ways. The people are referred to in verse 17 as all Israel and the whole nation. Just as the waters were completely cut off, so now the entire nation completed its crossing. This last point effectively wraps up this portion of the episode. But something new is introduced as well. The twofold reference to the dry ground. This gives us a still different perspective on the miracle, as we've already said. The waters were so completely stopped up that the priest stood and the people crossed on dry ground. There were no shallow crossing places to be found. Since the waters were at flood stage this time of year, a true miracle was needed. The end of verse 15 refers to the early summer harvest. When the river was still swollen from the spring melting of the snow on the mountains of the north, and also the spring rains. The crossing was actually done on the 10th day of the first month, according to chapter 4 and verse 19, which corresponds to our period of March or April. Thus, the fact that Israel not only crossed the Jordan during flood stage, but did so on dry ground, and as I mentioned earlier, not muddy ground, makes the miracle even more impressive. Now, these events naturally call to mind the Red Sea crossing in Exodus 14 and 15. There also, in that place, also God miraculously separated the waters that allowed the Israelites to cross on dry ground. There also the waters stood in a heap, Exodus 15:8. And there also the miracle was for the immediate purpose of crossing a great obstacle of water, but it was for the larger purpose of glorifying God and confirming his chosen leader, Moses, in the eyes of the people, just as this miracle here glorified God and confirmed his chosen leader, Joshua. Now, while the ideal situation would be to cover every verse of this book, as we said before, we simply are not going to be able to do so because we have so much other material to cover in this class. So from this point forward, we will simply hit the highlights of the book of Joshua and see what we can learn. Now, chapter 4 celebrates the great miracle of the crossing by going over much of the same ground as chapter 3, adding to it and looking at the event from still different perspectives than we've seen up to now. It also gives instructions in a dignified way for the memorializing of this event by the building of an altar, which was to stand as a constant reminder to Israel and the nations of God's great hand. The chapter may be divided into two major sections, verses 1 through 14 and verses 15 through 24, with chapter 5 and verse 1 forming the proper conclusion to the second section. At the end of each section, the author offers his own comment evaluating the events or the effect of the events so far. In chapter 4 and verse 14, it says, that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him all the days of his life, just as they had revered Moses. In chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until we had crossed over, their hearts melted, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Now, the first of these comments shows the effect of the events in Israel. That is, Joshua was exalted by God in the eyes of the Israelites, just as Moses had been. The second of the comments shows the effects of the events outside of Israel, that is, outside the people of God. The kings of the land were terrified because of Israel. Now, the lesson I would like us to see in this chapter is that it is important to God that his people remember significant events in their history and what he did for them in those events. The focus is not on the event itself, but on God, and that those who remember will have a proper view of God. Notice specifically verses 20 through 24 of Joshua chapter 4. Joshua 4, 20 through 24 says, those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed. That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Now, many other examples can be given. You have the Passover feast, which was instituted so that they could remember what God had done for them in Egypt in saving the firstborn. Thus, the memorial feast is about God and his love for his people. Back in Exodus 12 and verse 14, It says, "Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance." And then in verses 24 through 27 of Exodus 12, it says, "And you shall observe this event as an ordinance for you and your children forever, when you enter the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children say to you, 'What does this rite mean to you?' And you shall say, 'It is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes.'" Now, given these facts, the facts that God instituted these two feasts in order to remember what he had done, it is no surprise then that Christ told his followers to remember his death, burial, and resurrection and what he did for us through the Lord's Supper. Therefore, again, the memorial feast is about Christ and what he did for those who would take advantage of the sacrifices that he made. In Luke chapter 22, verses 19 and 20, Luke 22, 19 and 20, "And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And in the same way he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup, which is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood.'" Now, this is spoken of again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 26. Paul says there, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death, until he comes." So, just as in the Old Testament, there were memorials set up to remember the things that God had done, we also in the New Testament have the memorial of the Lord's Supper, in which we remember the sacrifice, the suffering, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This brings us to chapter 5 of Joshua. Joshua 5 records actions that are all concerned with holiness in one way or another, not with military preparedness. Now, to me, if I were about to go to war, the first thing on my mind would be military preparations. But the fact that spiritual preparations preceded the actual conquest of the land illustrates certain priorities. Number one, God was going to give Israel the land, and Israel's task was to be sure that it obeyed and was adequately prepared spiritually. Thus, the real action of the book is delayed by several important, even essential preliminary matters. The warnings to Joshua about keeping the law, and the warnings to the tribes on the other side of the Jordan about keeping unity within the nation, and remembering God's miraculous help and sanctifying the people. I think the lesson for today that we get from chapter 5 is that while we have many things, even important things, to distract us in this world, our main priority is to become and remain holy before God. Peter said in 1 Peter 1, 14 through 16, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy. When we do that, everything else in our lives will fall right in line with what God wants, and God will protect us and bless us. Now we come to chapter 6 and the destruction of Jericho. The story of Israel's first victory in the land is told in exquisite detail. Just as the crossing of the Jordan was treated as an important event to be solemnly undertaken with proper ritual preparation and commemoration, so also the taking of Jericho was to be done properly and in order. God gave precise instructions for the taking of the city, which involved careful circling of the city rather than classic military tactics. Joshua, as God's faithful representative, instructed the people accordingly. The dramatic buildup and climax of the action is told in verses 8 through 21, and in the aftermath, several loose threads, so to speak, are tied up. The story is repetitive, but the detail with which the account is told emphasizes the importance of this city and its destruction. It was the first city captured by the Israelites, and as such, its capture represented the entire takeover of the land. Excuse me. The Israelites' taking of the other cities and their kings is compared several times to what happened in Jericho. This is found in chapter 8, 1 and 2, and chapter 10, verses 28 and 30. And at the end of Joshua's life, when he summarized the taking of the land, Jericho was the only city he mentioned by name, even though he mentioned 7 nations and several kings who fought against Israel. Now, I believe that this chapter should teach us the importance of obeying God in every detail. If we try to leave something out or add something to what God has instructed, then we will be guilty of disobeying God. This is clearly seen in the next chapter, where we will learn that Achan did not obey God in that he took some of the spoils from Jericho. We also see it in Leviticus chapter 10, where Nadab and Abihu did everything right except one thing. They offered the incense with fire from the wrong location, and they were killed for their disobedience. So it is important to obey God in everything that he says, even if you think that it's unimportant. It must be done. That's what this chapter and many other places in the Bible teach us. Excuse me again. Now we come to chapter 7. The account in this chapter is bound up with the one in the next chapter. So much so that many scholars bring both chapters together under one heading. The sin that Achan committed, its consequences for the nation, and the process of discovery and punishment of the sin are all related here. The defeat at the hands of the men of Ai is followed by victory over these same men in chapter 8. The victory was made possible because of the cleansing of the nation that had been defiled by the sin of one man. Also, several parallels exist between the account concerning Rahab and the one concerning Achan. In Joshua 2, Rahab, a believing Canaanite, acted faithfully, and as a result was promised deliverance from destruction. In one sense, she became an Israelite. In Joshua 7, the man by the name of Achan, a disbelieving Israelite, acted without faith, and as a result he was not delivered but was destroyed. In effect, he became a Canaanite. Achan thus stands opposite to Rahab, and the two characters embody striking contrasts. Three lessons, I think, should be in view for us today. First, when we sin, we will suffer defeat at the hands of God. Second, just as Achan's sin affected the whole nation, so also does our sin affect the whole congregation, especially if our sin is public and we will not repent. Paul deals with this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where he said that sin is like yeast in a lump of dough. If the yeast is not removed, it will eventually spread to the rest of the lump. Second, or third, I guess, just as the nation stood up and removed the sinner and the sin from within them, the local congregation needs to lovingly stand up to the unrepentant sinner and withdraw fellowship from him or her, as Paul said to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and other places. Now, it's a hard thing to do sometimes, but it must be done. The purpose of such discipline is first and foremost so that the sinner might recognize the seriousness of what they have done and repent, returning to the fellowship of God, fellowship of Christ, and the fellowship of his or her fellow Christians. And I would add that another purpose, as stated by Paul there in 1 Corinthians 5, another purpose of disfellowshipping those who are unrepentant is to let others know within the congregation and outside the congregation, to let others know the seriousness of sin and that sin will not be tolerated. Again, we're talking about unrepented sin, someone who is obstinate and arrogant and will not even admit that they have sinned. They will not make it right. Okay? This is what Paul is getting at in 1 Corinthians 5 and other places. So, a lot of lessons to be learned from chapter 7. Chapter 8 is the destruction of the city of Ai. The account of the destruction of this city follows immediately upon the story in chapter 7 of Achan's sin, the resulting defeat at Ai, and the punishment of that sin. In the larger perspective of the book, there should never have been any question concerning the Israelites' ability to take Ai, since the Lord was on their side. However, in the immediate context of the sin of Achan, the defeat at Ai brought great distress. It caused Joshua and the people to fear and to raise questions to God. Chapter 7, verses 5 through 9. The trauma was alleviated by Israel's removing the evil from among them. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was gone, and the great victory was achieved after the events of chapter 7. Again, God was no longer angry with Israel, since atonement had been made for the sin. And the task now was to get on with the conquest. Therefore, he gave the city of Ai into the hands of the Israelites. They captured it through an elaborate ambush. And that victory is described in some detail, more so than any other battle in the book. It is the first true military victory recounted, since the taking of Jericho can hardly be called a battle. And it involved a military strategy for which the Lord gave instructions. The lesson for us then is that when we do what is right concerning sin, God will give us the victory. In today's terms, when sin is removed from a congregation, either by withdrawing from the sinner or by the sinner's repenting, then the congregation is strengthened. The congregation is also warned by these actions that sin will not be tolerated. That brings us to the end of this session. Excuse me. And we'll pick up with chapter 9 in session 5. But again, feel free, if I've said anything that you have a question about, if you have any questions about the text itself, question about the assignments for the class, whatever it is, feel free to call me. I'll do anything I can to help in any way. Have a great day.